I'm Grace Denny, and welcome back to Wildcat Books. Have you ever had a pet that you love so much and can't imagine living without? Well, let's read about T-Bone and the baby's friendship in T-Bone the Babysitter by Clare, Turlay, Newberry. Mr. and Mrs. Penny were very lucky to have a good babysitter. His name was T-Bone, and he was a large, kindly black and white cat. While Mrs. Penny did the housework, T-Bone sat with the baby. He sat with her in her bassinet when she took her airing on the porch. He sat with her in her playpen while she played with her toys. And when she took her nap, T-Bone sat on the dresser beside her crib and purred till she fell asleep. Sometimes he pushed her in her swing, but mostly he just sat. Of course, being only a cat, there were some things he could not do. He was no good at all with bottles or safety pins, nor was he expected to give the baby her bath. But when it came to just plain sitting, he was perfect. But one morning, T-Bone did not feel like babysitting. He woke up feeling wild and pouncy and full of mischief. While the baby was having her bath, he got into the drawer where her clean clothes were kept and scratched them all out on the floor. "Bad kitty!" scolded Mrs. Penny, but T-Bone didn't care. He felt like being naughty. He scampered into the bathroom where Mrs. Penny's nylon stockings were drying on the towel rack and pulled them all down. "Shame on you, T-Bone!" cried Mrs. Penny, but T-Bone just grabbed a stocking and ran with it under the sofa. When it was time for the baby's nap, T-Bone did not sit on the dresser and purr. He climbed up on the highest shelf in the clothes closet where Mrs. Penny kept her hats and knocked them all off on the floor. Then he pounced on one of them, a small pink feather hat, and began to rip it to pieces. The baby thought that was very funny. She sat up in her crib and laughed out loud. "Now why isn't that baby asleep?" wondered Mrs. Penny, and she went into the bedroom to see. And there was T-Bone, tearing up her nicest hat, the one she wore to parties when she wanted to look especially pretty. "T-Bone, you awful, awful cat!" screamed Mrs. Penny, and if she had not been a grown-up lady, I believe she would have cried. Just then, Aunt Mabel, who lived in the country, drove up in her station wagon. She was quite shocked to hear what a bad kitty T-Bone had been. "My dear girl," explained Aunt Mabel, "how ridiculous to keep such an animal in your house. The only place for a cat like that is the country. You had better let me take him back to the ranch with me. He can live in the barn and catch mice." "Take him by all means," cried Mrs. Penny, who was feeling very cross about the pink hat. "I don't think I could stand another day of him." So Aunt Mabel gathered up T-Bone, bundled him into the back seat of the station wagon, and drove off. The next day, when the baby was put on the porch for her airing, she began to cry, for there was no T-Bone to sit with her. Her mother put her in the playpen with all her toys, but she would not play with them. She just cried and cried for T-Bone. When it was time for her nap, she would not go to sleep, for there was no T-Bone purring on the dresser. She sat up in her crib and cried and cried and cried. So Mrs. Penny rocked the baby to comfort her and sang songs to her and played peekaboo and patty cake and this little pig went to market over and over and over. But the moment Mrs. Penny stopped to rest, the baby remembered how sad she was without T-Bone and cried louder than ever. Mrs. Penny did not have time to wash the dishes or make the beds or run the vacuum cleaner or anything. And when Mr. Penny came home that evening, there was no dinner on the table, for Mrs. Penny had no time to cook it. "Oh, Walter," she wailed when she saw her husband, "we should never have let T-Bone go. The baby has been crying for him all day long. Darling, we simply must get him back." Of course, honey. Anything you say," Mr. Penny agreed soothingly. "I'll drive out to Aunt Mabel's for him tomorrow if you wish. I'll tell him all is forgiven." Out in the country, T-Bone was not happy either. There was altogether too much barking and neighing and mooing to suit his taste. Besides, there was a fierce rooster that kept chasing him all over the barnyard. Worst of all, he was hungry, for Aunt Mabel believed that a saucer of milk was enough for any cat. When T-Bone asked her politely for meat, she looked at him coldly and said, "Go catch a mouse." This was easier said than done, for T-Bone had grown quite stout from so much babysitting. He was so glad to see Mr. Penny the next day that he jumped right into the car beside him and purred all the way home. When T-Bone got home, he found a delicious lunch waiting for him under the kitchen table. Warm milk with cereal in it, and all the liver he could eat. And nothing whatever was said about pink feather hats. Check out this book at your local library if you want to see how the baby reacted to T-Bone coming back home.